Castlevania: Dawn of Sorrow, originally released in August of 2005 for the Nintendo DS, is currently available on all modern platforms in the Castlevania Dominus Collection, released August of 2024. The collection retails for $24.99. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow is a direct sequel to Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. It follows the same protagonist, Soma Cruz, and he has his same abilities to absorb the powers of enemies. However, he's apparently forgotten all of the abilities from the first game. And for reasons that go unexplained, many of the enemies actually give you completely different abilities this time, though not all of them. Is there any explanation for why the same enemies now give you different abilities? None whatsoever. But anyway, Soma finds himself again drawn into a situation where someone's trying to resurrect Dracula, the Dark Lord. And as it turns out, Soma Cruz isn't the only candidate for becoming the Dark Lord. There are two other characters. Dario, a man with fire abilities, and Dimitri, a man that can mimic the abilities of others. And the details of how you deal with these gentlemen will determine which ending you get, of which there are 3. While this game does bear many similarities to Aria of Sorrow, including the gathering of abilities being incredibly grind-heavy at times, it does have some new mechanics, those being a weapon upgrade system, and the magic seal system for bosses. Upgrading weapons is fairly straightforward, as a sword will always turn into a better sword, an axe into a better axe, so forth and so on. And the upgrades work by combining a particular weapon with a particular demon ability, and in some cases, there's more than one way to upgrade a weapon. And this will be your primary way of getting better weapons in the game, as you will still find weapons around and dropped off of enemies, but they are far less common than in other Castlevania games. And if you're willing to put in the effort to grind for the right abilities, you can get some very overpowered weapons very early on. The other new mechanic is the magic seal system. This mechanic only affects boss fights. In the original version of the game, when you fought a boss and it ran out of hit points, you would then have to draw something on the touchscreen to actually finish the boss. It starts out simply with basically a check mark, but by the end of the game became a very intricate pattern you had to draw. In the collection version of this game, you no longer have to draw anything. Instead, you input a combination of buttons that's somewhat akin to doing a combo in a fighting game, which honestly makes the collection version of this game far superior to the original DS version. It is worth noting that on some bosses, even after completing the seal, you can still die to some of their lingering attacks. It can only happen on a few boss fights, but it's still notable that it can happen. The magic seal system has often been seen as the worst aspect of Dawn of Sorrow, with many claiming it was only in the game to use the gimmick that was the touchscreen on the Nintendo DS. However, I think it may have been an attempt, a flawed attempt, to balance out the weapon upgrading system. Because if you're looking to upgrade your weapons as soon as possible, you're going to be doing a lot of grinding on particular enemies. And grinding on any given enemy will of course give you experience that levels you up, and you'll become overpowered not just from your gear, but from just leveling, which under normal circumstances would make the bosses completely a non-issue. They'd be jokes, not even challenges. But because of the magic seal mechanic, it's not just about getting their hit points to 0. And in the original version, actually doodling the sketch you need to doodle is difficult at times, and what the DS would actually register as correct seemed completely arbitrary. And that led to much frustration on the part of virtually everyone who ever played it. So this new version doesn't strip out the mechanic, it instead replaces it with a series of button presses, which at the very least is far more reliable, as if you do mess up the seal, you know it's because you hit the wrong button. So you never think that it has to do with the hardware. It is instead entirely a skill issue. After beating the game, you unlock Julius mode. In this mode, you start out by controlling Julius Belmont. But as you play, you will recruit Yoko and Alucard to your team, all three of which have set abilities and equipment, and you can switch freely between them, as you will need to use the different characters to overcome different obstacles in the castle. The castle's overall layout is exactly the same as in the main game, but there are some small tweaks to specific rooms because of the limitations of the character's abilities. While you can't change your gear, each character does have different skills you can cycle through. And in this mode, there is no need to worry about seals. And if you get to the end of this mode, you get to fight Soma, having apparently actually become the Dark Lord. This mode is an interesting addition, and it's very easy to find yourself in areas of the castle that you're simply not strong enough for yet. So I'd advise you to follow roughly the same path you would follow in the main game. Or you could just spend some time grinding to just skip right to the end. As since you don't gain abilities to access more of the castle, most of the bosses here are in fact optional. But overall, this makes for an interesting Castlevania 3 tribute act. Or maybe a beta for the next game in this series, but we'll get to that game some other day. Probably sooner rather than later. So is Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow worth your time and money? Absolutely yes, if you're going to be playing it in the Castlevania Dominus Collection, as the collection is only $25, and Dawn of Sorrow, when it first released on the DS, would have been $40 by itself. Dawn of Sorrow also makes for an interesting Castlevania, because it takes place in the modern era, and at the time of its original release was actually a few years in the future, making it literally the last chapter in the Castlevania franchise. It took nearly 2 decades for this game to get a re-release. Maybe that's a sign we'll finally get to know what happens after this game. But either way, the collection release of this game really is the best possible way to experience Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. My only remaining question is why they chose to change the art style between Aria and Dawn, as Aria went for a much more classic style for the characters' in-game portraits, where Dawn chose to go full anime style. It's not an issue either way, I'm just curious why this change was made. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.